Rain slicked the pavement of Westbrook Park, scattering the usual Sunday crowd into doorways and under awnings. Nobody noticed the 7-year-old girl huddled beneath the sprawling sycamore tree, shivering in a cashmere coat that cost more than most people's rent. Nobody except Riley. Riley didn't see a high-value asset in a brutal territorial war. She just saw a terrified kid crying for her mom. She bought her a hot chocolate. 30 minutes later, 6 armored SUVs surrounded the plaza, and the city's worst nightmare stepped out to collect her daughter. Riley's feet ached with that specific hollow throb that only comes from 12 hours of standing on cracked linoleum. Her apron still smelled faintly of burnt espresso and sour milk, and her scent, something warm and woodsy, like cedar after rain, was starting to go sharp with exhaustion. She just wanted to sit. The park bench was damp. The iron cold bit through her thin denim jeans, but she didn't care. She closed her eyes, letting the autumn wind whip at her cheeks. A sharp, ragged intake of breath broke the quiet. Riley opened her eyes. 10 yards away, partially hidden by the thick trunk of an ancient sycamore, a child was crying. Not the loud, performative wail of a toddler throwing a tantrum, but a silent, chest-heaving panic that made Riley's alpha instincts prickle uncomfortably beneath her skin. She watched for a long moment. The girl was maybe 5 or 6, small for her age, but dressed like a miniature aristocrat, dark wool pea coat, perfectly pressed trousers, leather boots that had never seen a puddle. She was currently ruining them by dragging her toe through the wet gravel, her small hands clutching the lapels of her coat. Riley looked around. The park was mostly empty, chased clear by the impending storm. A lone jogger disappeared down a paved path. A homeless man slept on a distant bench under a newspaper. No panicked parents. No nannies scrolling on their phones. She sighed. Her bus was due in 12 minutes. If she missed it, she waited an hour. She looked at the kid. The girl wiped her nose on her expensive sleeve, a quiet sob racking her small frame. "Damn it," Riley muttered. She pushed herself off the bench, her worn canvas sneakers crunching on the gravel. As she approached, the girl flinched, scrambling backward until her back hit the rough bark of the tree. Her eyes, a striking, pale gray, were wide with a practiced kind of terror that made Riley's stomach twist. "Hey," Riley said, stopping a few feet away. She kept her voice low, flat, and crouched down so she wasn't towering over the child. She consciously softened her posture, pulling her shoulders in, trying to make her alpha frame look smaller. "I'm not going to grab you. Just wanted to know if you're lost." The girl stared at her. She didn't speak. "You got a name, kid?" Silence. She looked left, then right, scanning the park with a hypervigilance that made Riley's protective instincts roar to life. This wasn't normal. This was a child who'd been taught to be afraid. "Okay. Keep your secrets." Riley shifted her weight, feeling the dampness of the ground seeping into her shoes. "I'm Riley. I work at the coffee shop across the street. My feet hurt. I'm freezing. And you look like you're about to vibrate out of your shoes. Did you lose your mom? Dad?" The girl's lower lip trembled. "My mother," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, wrecked from crying. "Okay. Good start. Where did you see her last?" "I didn't." The girl wiped her eyes again. "I was with Margaret." "But Margaret fell down." Riley frowned. "Fell down? Where?" "In the alley by the toy store." The girl's breathing hitched. A man made a loud noise. "Margaret fell. She told me to run and not stop. So I ran." A cold spike of adrenaline hit Riley's bloodstream. A loud noise. A woman falling down. Telling a kid to run. This wasn't a lost child situation. This was something else entirely. She kept her face completely neutral. I see. And Margaret is your mom? No. Margaret is my detail. Detail. Not babysitter. Not aunt. Detail. Riley slowly reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing her cracked cell phone. She thought about calling the police. Then she looked at the kid. The girl was shaking violently now, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving her freezing in the damp autumn air. Right. Well, Margaret told you to run, and you did a good job. You're safe here. Riley forced a tired, reassuring smile. You like hot chocolate? The girl hesitated, then gave a microscopic nod. There's a vendor cart right over there. Riley pointed to the edge of the plaza where a bored teenager was scrolling on a phone behind a steaming cart. I'm going to buy you one. And I'll buy me a coffee. Then we'll figure out how to call your mom. Deal? The girl looked at her hands, empty. She looked at her face as exhausted, pale, entirely unthreatening. Deal, she whispered. They walked to the cart. Riley didn't hold her hand, she sensed the girl wouldn't like it, but she kept herself between the child and the street. She bought a watered-down coffee for herself and a scalding hot chocolate for the girl, sacrificing the crumpled $5 bill she'd meant to use for dinner. They sat on a low concrete wall. The girl held the paper cup with both hands, letting the steam warm her face. I'm Sloane, she said suddenly. Nice to meet you, Sloane. Your mom have a phone number you remember? Sloane nodded. Yes. But Margaret said never to use a stranger's phone to call it. She said people can track the signal. Riley stopped mid-sip. The coffee burned her tongue. She stared at the 6-year-old. Who exactly is your mother? Sloane took a tiny sip of her hot chocolate, leaving a marshmallow mustache on her upper lip. She's in shipping. Shipping, Riley echoed. Yes. Right. Riley rubbed her temples. The headache was setting in beautifully. Well, since we can't use my phone, what's the protocol? Do we wait here? Yes. They will find me. They have trackers in my coat. Riley blinked. She looked at the cashmere coat. Trackers. Of course they did. She didn't ask any more questions. She didn't want to know. She sat beside Sloane in the biting cold, sipping terrible coffee, watching the gray sky darken into twilight. She talked to her about mundane things, the stray cat that lived behind the coffee shop, her broken toaster, the customer who'd tried to pay with a bag of loose change that morning. Sloane listened with intense, solemn focus, as if Riley's stories about burnt bagels were vital tactical information. For 20 minutes, they were just a tired alpha and a lost girl. Two strangers sharing warmth in the cold. Then the world tilted on its axis. It didn't happen with sirens. It happened with a suffocating, heavy silence. The low rumble of heavy engines vibrated through the soles of Riley's worn shoes before she actually saw the vehicles. 3 black Chevy Suburbans abruptly boxed in the park's eastern entrance, their tires hopping the curb with aggressive precision. A second later, 3 more sealed the western exit. The vendor cart operator dropped his phone, took one look at the convoy, abandoned his cart, and fast walked away into the gloom. The few remaining people in the park suddenly found urgent reasons to be somewhere else. The air thickened. Riley stood up. Her instinct screamed at her to run. Every survival mechanism forged by years of living in a rough city fired at once. But she didn't run. She couldn't. Not with Sloane sitting there, small and terrified. "Sloane," she said, her voice tight. Sloane didn't stand. She just stared at the lead Suburban, her small hands gripping the paper cup so hard the plastic lid popped off, spilling warm cocoa onto her expensive trousers. She didn't seem to notice. The doors of the SUVs opened in unison. Men poured out. They didn't look like cops. They didn't look like standard security guards. They wore dark, tailored suits that hid the bulk of body armor beneath, and they moved with terrifying efficiency, fanning out, securing the perimeter, their hands resting naturally near their waistbands. One woman stepped out of the rear passenger side of the central vehicle. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She walked. The gravel crunched under her polished dress shoes. She was tall, easily 6 feet, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal overcoat unbuttoned to reveal a dark suit beneath. Her face was carved from granite, sharp jaw, straight nose, and the exact same pale gray eyes as the girl sitting on the wall. But where Sloane's eyes held fear, this woman's eyes held a cold, absolute violence. She looked like a woman who was used to ordering the tide to stop and executing the ocean when it refused. Riley felt her breath catch in her throat. The scent hit her a second later, something dark and expensive, like leather and gunpowder, and something deeper, something purely alpha that made Riley's own alpha instincts want to either fight or submit. It was oppressive, suffocating, and utterly intoxicating. She stepped slightly in front of Sloane. A purely involuntary, stupidly protective gesture. 2 of the suits flanked the woman. Their eyes scanned the trees, the rooftops, ignoring Riley entirely. "Sloane," the woman said. Her voice was a low, rich alto. It didn't carry over the wind, it cut through it. Sloane scrambled off the wall. "Mama." She didn't run to her mother. She walked quickly, her head ducked as if ashamed. The woman dropped to one knee, ignoring the wet gravel ruining her trousers. She caught the girl by the shoulders, her large hands pulling Sloane in. She didn't hug her immediately. She quickly, clinically ran her hands over the girl's arms, her ribs, checking for blood, for broken bones. Finding none, she finally let out a harsh breath and pulled the girl into her chest, burying her face in Sloane's dark hair. For a fraction of a second, the terrifying statue of a woman crumbled into just a mother. Then she stood up. The vulnerability vanished, locked away behind a steel vault. She looked at Riley. Riley felt like she'd been shoved under a microscope. The woman's gaze swept over her, her messy bun, her cheap oversized flannel, her stained apron, the empty coffee cup in her shaking hand. But it wasn't just assessment. Riley felt something else in that gaze, something that made her sense spike with awareness. The woman's nostrils flared almost imperceptibly, and Riley knew she was scenting her. "Who are you?" the woman asked. The question wasn't a request for an introduction. It was an interrogation. "Riley," she managed to say. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again, anger suddenly piercing through her fear. She was tired. She was cold. She'd just spent her dinner money on this woman's kid. "I'm Riley. I found her crying by the tree." She said her detail got hurt. The woman's jaw tightened at the mention of the detail. She looked down at Sloane. "Is this true?" "Yes, Mama," Sloane said softly. Margaret fell. "I ran. She bought me hot chocolate." The woman looked back at Riley. The hostility in her eyes didn't fade, but it shifted, became a calculating, heavy weight. One of the men in suits stepped forward, leaning in to whisper something in her ear. "Perimeter is clear, Miss Kane. No sign of the shooters. Margaret is dead in the alley." Kane. The name hit Riley like a physical blow to the stomach. Valentina Kane. She wasn't just in shipping, she owned the docks, the unions, half the politicians in the city. She was the ghost story cops told each other. She was the most feared alpha in the territory, a woman who'd built an empire on blood and loyalty and absolute, ruthless control. Riley had just bought hot chocolate for the heir to a criminal empire. Valentina nodded slightly to her man, dismissing him. She took a step toward Riley. Riley held her ground, though her knees felt like water. You didn't ask her for a number to call, Valentina said. I did. Riley crossed her arms defensively. She told me she couldn't use a stranger's phone because of trackers. Which, by the way, is a messed up thing for a 6-year-old to know. The suits around them stiffened. Nobody spoke to Valentina Kane like that. Valentina didn't blink. She just stared at Riley. Her scent shifted, still dangerous, but threaded with something else. Something almost like curiosity. You sat with her in the open. I kept her calm. I kept her visible. If whoever was shooting at your guy came looking, they would have seen a bored barista and a kid drinking cocoa. Not a target hiding in the bushes. A beat of silence passed. Valentina's eyes narrowed slightly. She was dissecting Riley's logic, finding it sound. She reached inside her overcoat. Riley flinched, stepping back. The suits instantly reacted, hands dropping to their holsters. Valentina raised a single hand, stopping her men instantly. She pulled out a sleek black leather wallet, extracting a thick fold of $100 bills, had to be $3, maybe $4,000. She held it out to Riley. For your time. And the hot chocolate. Riley looked at the money. She thought about her rent, 3 weeks past due. Her credit card maxed out from her mother's medical bills. The electricity shut-off notice sitting on her kitchen counter. Then she looked at Sloane. The girl was watching her, her small face pale. I didn't do it for a payout, Riley said. Her voice shook, but she kept her hands shoved deep in her pockets. I did it because she was crying. Valentina's hand remained extended for a long 5 seconds. She wasn't used to people refusing her money. She wasn't used to people refusing her anything. Slowly, she lowered her hand. She put the money away. Get in the car, Sloane, Valentina said quietly. Sloane hurried to the open door of the central SUV, climbing in and looking back at Riley one last time before the tinted door slammed shut, sealing her away in her armored world. Valentina buttoned her overcoat. She looked at Riley, her expression unreadable. People who do favors for me usually want something in return, Valentina said. It is a rare thing to find someone who doesn't. Riley muttered, consider it a freebie. She backed away toward the street. Have a good night, Miss Kane. She turned and walked away. She didn't run. She forced herself to walk at a normal, steady pace, feeling the crosshairs of half a dozen armed men tracking her back. It wasn't until she turned the corner 2 blocks away that she collapsed against a brick wall and threw up her cheap coffee into a storm drain. 3 days passed. The adrenaline wore off, leaving behind a deep, paralyzing paranoia. Every time a black car drove past the coffee shop window, Riley dropped a mug. Every time the bell above the door chimed, her heart hammered against her ribs. She scoured the local news, but there was no mention of a shootout in an alley, no mention of a dead bodyguard named Margaret. In Valentina Kane's city, blood was cleaned up before the press ever heard the sirens. By Thursday, the fear began to dull, replaced by the crushing, mundane reality of being broke. You're distracted, Clow, Stan, the owner of the shop, grunted. He wiped down the espresso machine with a gray rag. You messed up 3 lattes this morning. Sorry, Stan. Didn't sleep well. Well, wake up. Lunch rush is coming. It was 2 p.m. The lunch rush had actually just ended, leaving the shop quiet. Rain beat against the large front window. Riley was sweeping coffee grounds off the floor near the back register when the chime above the door rang. She didn't look up immediately. Be right with you. Heavy footsteps crossed the hardwood floor, not the hurried shuffle of a student looking for Wi-Fi, not the clicking heels of a businesswoman. It was a slow, deliberate stride. Riley looked up. A massive woman in a dark suit stood on the other side of the counter. She had a thick neck, a flattened nose that had been broken multiple times, and a cauliflower ear. She looked like a freight train squeezed into worsted wool. Riley gripped the broom handle. Can I help you? The woman didn't answer. She turned to the 2 college students sitting at a corner table, walked over, reached into her pocket, and dropped a crisp $100 bill onto their textbooks. Shop's closed, the woman rumbled. Take your coffees to go. The students looked at the giant, looked at the money, and scrambled out the door in under 10 seconds. Stan came barreling out of the back room. Hey! What the hell do you think you're doing? You can't just clear out my... The woman in the suit turned her flat, dead eyes on Stan. He stopped mid-sentence, his bravado evaporating. The bell chimed again. Valentina Kane walked in. She brought the chill of the storm inside with her. She wore a dark navy suit today, no overcoat, perfectly tailored to her broad frame. She took off her leather gloves, slipping them into her pocket. She didn't look like a mob boss. She looked like a CEO. But the air in the room died the moment she crossed the threshold. Stan backed up until his spine hit the commercial refrigerator. He knew who this was. Everyone knew who this was. Valentina ignored Stan completely. Her cold gray eyes found Riley, frozen by the cash register. She walked to the counter, looked at the menu board written in colorful chalk, then back at Riley. I'll take a black coffee, Valentina said. Riley stared at her. Her throat was bone dry. Mechanically, she set the broom aside, grabbed a paper cup, and filled it from the dripper. Her hands shook so badly she spilled a few drops on the counter. She snapped a lid on it and set it down. $2.50, she whispered. Valentina didn't reach for her wallet. She picked up the cup, took a sip, and didn't flinch at the heat or the bitter burnt taste of Stan's cheap beans. I don't like owing debts, Riley, Valentina said. Her voice was conversational, quiet, yet it carried an undeniable weight. It makes me uncomfortable. I told you, Riley said, forcing her voice to steady. You don't owe me anything. I helped a kid. You intervened in my affairs. You did so bravely and foolishly. But you kept my daughter safe while my men were neutralizing a threat. That places a debt on my ledger. Valentina pulled a folded piece of heavy cardstock from her inner pocket, placing it on the counter and sliding it toward Riley. Riley looked down. It wasn't cash. It was a document. She recognized the letterhead. It was from the debt collection agency handling her mother's hospital bills. What is this? She asked. A receipt. Riley picked it up with trembling fingers. The total was there, $42,000. Across the bottom, stamped in thick red ink, was the word paid in full. Her breath left her in a rush. She felt lightheaded. How did you get this? I am a woman of considerable resources. Valentina took another slow sip of the terrible coffee. Your landlord has also been persuaded to fix your leaking roof. I expect he will be quite eager to assist you from now on. You looked into me. Of course I did. Valentina's tone was matter of fact. I had to ensure you weren't a plant. An opportunist working for the people who tried to take my daughter. You are clean. Painfully ordinary, in fact. Just a barista drowning in medical debt. The sheer arrogance of it made Riley's temper flare, cutting through her terror. You can't just do this. I have already done it. I can't pay you back for this. Valentina's eyes darkened. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She leaned forward slightly, resting her large hands on the counter. You misunderstand the nature of this transaction, Valentina said softly. This is not a loan. This is me clearing my ledger. We are even. You do not owe me. And more importantly, I do not owe you. She stood up straight. My daughter asked about you. She wanted to know if the nice lady with the burnt coffee was safe. I told her you were. That is the end of our association. She turned and walked toward the door. The giant in the suit opened it for her. Wait. Riley called out. Valentina paused in the doorway, looking back over her shoulder. Thank you, Riley said. The anger was gone, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming relief that brought tears to the corners of her eyes. Valentina stared at her for a long moment. A muscle worked in her jaw. For a second, just a fraction of a second, the cold machinery of the mob boss slipped, and Riley saw the tired, stressed mother underneath. Don't thank me, Riley. Valentina said quietly. Just pray our paths never cross again. The door closed behind her. The bell chimed. Through the rain-streaked window, Riley watched the black SUVs pull away, melting into the gray traffic. She didn't know it yet, but Valentina Kane was wrong. Her ledger wasn't clear. In her world, debts of blood and mercy were never truly paid in full. They just bought you time. 2 months passed. The city tipped into a bitter, freezing November. For the first 4 weeks, Riley woke up expecting a mistake. She checked her mail religiously, waiting for a letter from the collection agency claiming a clerical error. It never came. Her mother's account remained at a flat, impossible zero. The relief should have been absolute, a lifting of a physical weight. Instead, it felt like standing on a trapdoor. Valentina Kane didn't do favors, and she didn't leave loose ends. The sudden absence of her crushing debt left a ringing silence in her life, loud enough to drive her crazy. By week 8, the paranoia finally began to dull. Riley stopped scanning the street for black SUVs. She stopped freezing every time a woman in a tailored suit walked past the cafe window. She let herself believe she had slipped back into the cracks of the city, right where she belonged. She was wrong. It was a Tuesday night. The rain was turning into sleet, hitting the cafe's front window like handfuls of thrown gravel. Stan had gone home early to nurse a gout flare-up, leaving Riley to close. She wiped down the steam wands, the smell of bleach and roasted beans sharp in her nose. The open sign buzzed a dull neon red. The bell above the door chimed. Riley didn't look up immediately. Sorry, espresso machine is clean. I can get you drip or tea, but we close in 5. Nobody answered. Riley tossed the damp rag into the sink and turned. 2 women stood just inside the door. They weren't Valentina Kane's people. Valentina's people moved with terrifying synchronized discipline. These 2 were different, heavy leather jackets over thick hoodies. The taller one had a fresh, jagged scar cutting through her left eyebrow. The shorter one was twitchy, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. They brought the smell of wet asphalt and cheap cigarettes into the clean shop. The shorter woman reached behind her, flipped the deadbolt on the glass door, and pulled the cord on the neon sign. The red glow died. Riley's heart slammed against her ribs. She took a slow step backward, her hip bumping the edge of the pastry case. Her phone was on the counter, 3 feet to her left, a lifetime away. "We don't have much cash," Riley said, her voice remarkably steady. "Stan did a drop at the bank 2 hours ago. Register's got maybe $80. Take it." "I don't care." The taller woman smiled, it didn't reach her eyes. "We don't want the register, Riley." Her name in the woman's mouth made her skin crawl. "I don't know you." "No. But we know your new friend." The tall woman stepped deeper into the shop, her boots squeaking on the wet linoleum. "Valentina Kane clears a 40 grand medical bill for a barista that makes noise. People look into that kind of noise." Riley stopped breathing. "She told me she was clearing her ledger. She didn't tell me she was painting a bullseye on my back." Riley forced herself to sound calm. "I don't know her. I made her a coffee. Once." "Bullshit." The shorter woman spat, pulling a heavy matte black pistol from her pocket. She didn't point it at Riley, just held it down by her thigh, a casual promise of violence. "Kane doesn't pay out that kind of scratch for a flat white. You were at the park. You had the kid. I just sat with a lost girl." Riley edged closer to the panic button installed under the counter. "I don't know anything about her business." "You're going to tell that to O'Connell." The tall woman closed the distance to the counter. "Walk out from back there. Nice and easy." Riley's fingers brushed the underside of the counter. She felt the plastic housing of the button. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The tall woman lunged over the counter. She was incredibly fast, her thick hand wrapping around Riley's forearm with a grip like a steel vise. Riley screamed, planting her feet and pulling back, but the woman yanked her forward with brutal force. Her ribs slammed into the edge of the counter, knocking the wind out of her. Before the woman could drag her over the top, the front window of the cafe exploded. It wasn't a shatter, it was a detonation. Glass sprayed into the room like shrapnel. The thunderclap of a high-caliber gunshot instantly deafened Riley. The tall woman holding her jerked violently, her grip vanishing as she collapsed backward, pulling a shelf of ceramic mugs down with her in a catastrophic crash. Riley dropped behind the counter, pressing herself into a tight ball against the floorboards, her hands covering her ears. Another shot. Plaster rained down on her hair. A woman screamed. Then silence. Just the heavy, rhythmic thud of the sleet hitting the sidewalk outside. "Riley." The voice was directly above her. She flinched, curling tighter. "Riley. Look at me." She forced her eyes open. Looking down at her over the rim of the counter was a woman she recognized. She'd been standing to the left of Valentina Kane in the park. She wore a damp trench coat and held a suppressed handgun angled toward the floor. Her face was entirely devoid of emotion. "Are you hit?" she asked. Riley looked at her hands, trembling so violently she could barely see them. She checked her chest, her legs. No blood. Just coffee grounds and glass dust. "No," she gasped. The woman nodded. "Get up. We are leaving." "The police," Riley started, looking toward the ruined front window. "They'll be here in exactly 4 minutes." The woman interrupted. "If you are here when they arrive, O'Connell's people will kill you in a holding cell before morning. Get up." She didn't offer her hand, she just waited. Riley scrambled to her feet, keeping her eyes fixed on the woman's broad back as she led her out the back door, into the freezing alley, and into the back of a waiting black sedan. The doors locked with a heavy, definitive thud. The car surged forward into the dark. They drove for nearly an hour, leaving the city grid behind. The streetlights thinned out, replaced by winding asphalt roads cutting through dense old-growth forest. Riley sat in the back seat, staring blankly at the rain sliding sideways across the tinted glass. The adrenaline crash left her nauseous and freezing. The woman in the front passenger seat, the shooter, hadn't spoken a single word since they left the alley. The car slowed, turning onto a long, unmarked driveway. Massive wrought iron gates swung open silently. The compound didn't look like a mobster's fortress from a movie. It looked like an Architectural Digest cover, sweeping lines of glass, dark steel, and slate built seamlessly into the side of a steep hill. The car stopped under a massive portico. The driver opened Riley's door. "Inside," she said. Riley stepped out, her legs feeling like wood. She followed the shooter through a pair of heavy oak doors into a sprawling foyer. The floors were polished concrete, the walls lined with stark brutalist art. It felt like a museum after closing time. "The library," the shooter said, pointing to a set of frosted glass doors. Riley walked toward them, pushing them open. The room was vast, lined with towering bookshelves and smelling of old paper and wood smoke. A fire cracked in a massive stone hearth. Valentina Kane stood by a heavy mahogany desk, pouring amber liquid into a crystal glass. She didn't wear a suit jacket, her white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms thick with muscle and the faded edge of a tattoo near her wrist. She looked up as Riley entered, her pale gray eyes snapping onto her, scanning from head to toe in a single clinical sweep. She took a drink, her jaw tight. "Hayes." Valentina's voice was sharp. The shooter stepped into the room behind Riley. Two of O'Connell's crew. They tried to bag her. I neutralized them. Casualties? Just the targets. The barista is untouched. Valentina set the glass down with a sharp clack. She nodded, dismissing Hayes. The doors closed, leaving Riley alone with the woman who owned the city. "Sit." Valentina gestured to a leather chair near the fire. "I prefer to stand." Riley snapped. Her voice shook, but the anger was rising rapidly, a hot protective fire burning away the shock. "Where am I?" "Safe." Valentina said simply. "Safe." Riley let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "My workplace just got shot up. 2 women are dead on the floor where I make lattes. I was almost kidnapped. Do not tell me I am safe." Valentina walked around the desk, leaning against it and crossing her arms. "You are alive because I placed a watcher on you, Riley. O'Connell's people are amateurs. I knew they would look for loose threads after the park. You put the thread there." Riley shouted, taking a step toward her, pointing a trembling finger at her chest. "I was a nobody. A ghost. You paid that hospital bill. You left a $42,000 paper trail pointing straight at my head." Valentina didn't flinch. She absorbed Riley's anger without a change in expression. "Yes." The word was flat. "Honest." Riley blinked, derailed by the lack of defense. "You knew paying it would make me a target?" "I knew it was a possibility. In my world, an unpaid debt is a vulnerability. I had to close the loop. I assumed my discretion was absolute. I underestimated O'Connell's desperation. For that, I take responsibility." "Responsibility?" Riley threw her hands up. What does that even mean to a woman like you? You buy me a new apron? You pay for my funeral? Valentina pushed off the desk. She moved incredibly fast for a woman her size. Before Riley could step back, she was standing directly in front of her, looming over her, broad and suffocating. The scent of her cedar, expensive scotch, and something coldly metallic, purely alpha, filled Riley's lungs. It means, Valentina said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming a lethal rumble, that anyone who touches you touches me. And I do not forgive trespassing. Riley stared up at her. She was terrified of her, deeply and instinctively. But looking into those gray eyes, she also realized something else. Valentina wasn't playing a game. She was violently, absolutely serious. Before Riley could respond, the heavy library doors creaked open. Riley jumped back. Valentina turned, her posture instantly shifting from an attack dog to a shield. A small head poked through the gap. Mama? It was Sloane. She was wearing flannel pajamas, clutching a battered stuffed bear. Her hair was messy from sleep. She rubbed her eyes, looking around the massive room until her gaze landed on Riley. She stopped, her pale gray eyes, exact replicas of her mother's, going wide. Riley, she whispered. Riley's chest tightened. All the anger evaporated, replaced by an agonizing ache. She was just a kid. A kid trapped in a war zone she didn't understand. She forced a smile. It felt brittle on her face, but she held it. Hey, Sloane. It's late for you to be up, isn't it? Sloane completely ignored her mother. She padded across the expensive rugs, walking straight to Riley. She stopped a foot away, looking at her dirty jeans, her torn flannel shirt, the plaster dust in her hair. Did you fall down? She asked seriously. Something like that, Riley said softly. Sloane nodded. She stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around Riley's waist, pressing her face into her stomach. Riley froze. She looked up at Valentina over the girl's head. The ruthless, terrifying mob boss was entirely gone. In her place was a woman watching her traumatized daughter willingly touch another human being for the first time since her other mother died. Valentina's eyes betrayed a profound, naked vulnerability. Her scent, usually so controlled, spiked with something raw and aching. Slowly, Riley rested her hand on the back of Sloane's head, her fingers brushing her dark hair. Valentina cleared her throat. The steel slammed back into place behind her eyes. Hayes will show you to a guest room, Riley. Get some sleep. We will discuss the parameters of your confinement tomorrow. Confinement? Riley echoed, her hand still resting on Sloane. You belong to O'Connell's war now. Valentina turned her back, walking back to the desk, picking up her glass. Until I enter. You don't leave this house. By the third day, Riley was losing her mind. The Kane compound was a masterpiece of modern design and absolute isolation. She had a bedroom the size of her entire apartment, featuring a king-sized bed with sheets that felt like spun water and a marble bathroom with a shower that could fit 4 people. Her closet had been stocked overnight with high-end sweaters, jeans, and soft cotton shirts in exactly her size. She hated all of it. Every luxury felt coated in blood. Every perfect meal prepared by the silent, efficient kitchen staff tasted like a bribe. She wasn't a guest. She was high-value cargo locked in a very expensive vault. She wasn't allowed outside without a woman named Cole, a heavily scarred ex-military type, shadowing her every step. She wasn't allowed near the front gates. Her phone had been confiscated by Hayes upon arrival, for her own signal security. The only bright spot in the oppressive, sterile house was Sloane. The girl gravitated to her like a sunflower to light. When Riley sat in the sunroom staring at the rain, Sloane would silently climb onto the sofa next to her with a book. When Riley paced the massive kitchen, Sloane would sit at the island watching her with those solemn, ancient eyes. She rarely spoke. But her presence was an anchor. Valentina Kane, however, was a phantom. She left the compound before Riley woke up and returned long after Riley retreated to her room. Riley heard the low crunch of the SUVs on the gravel driveway late at night, heard the heavy muffled voices of her lieutenants in the library. She was fighting a war. Tearing the city apart to find the woman who had ordered the hit at Riley's cafe. It wasn't until Thursday night that Riley finally cornered her. Riley couldn't sleep. The silence of the house was too heavy. She threw on an oversized cashmere sweater, refusing to appreciate how warm it was, and padded barefoot down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the kitchen. She turned the corner and froze. Valentina was sitting alone at the massive marble island. The overhead lights were off, the only illumination came from the under-cabinet LEDs. She was out of her suit, wearing dark sweatpants and a tight black t-shirt. She had a glass of water in front of her, a medical kit open on the counter. She was stitching a deep, ragged gash on her left bicep. She moved with practiced, terrifying efficiency, needle through the skin, pull the black thread, tie the knot, snip. Her jaw was locked tight, a light sheen of sweat catching the dim light. Riley's breath hitched. She should have turned around. She should have walked away. Instead, she stepped into the kitchen. Valentina's head snapped up. Her right hand instantly dropped to her waist, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. She relaxed a fraction of an inch when she saw Riley, but her eyes remained sharp. Defensive. "You should be asleep," she said roughly, her voice hoarse. "I could say the same to you." Riley kept her distance, looking at Valentina's arm. The cut was at least 4 inches long. "Do you need a hospital?" Valentina let out a dark, quiet chuckle. "I am the reason the hospitals are currently full, Riley. I don't go to them." She picked up the needle with a pair of forceps, angling her arm, struggling to get leverage on the back edge of the cut. She tried to push the needle through, but her grip slipped. A fresh line of dark blood ran down her triceps. She cursed under her breath. Riley crossed the kitchen. She didn't think about it, she just reacted to a person bleeding out on a marble counter. She stopped in front of Valentina, reaching out. Valentina stiffened, every muscle in her massive frame locking down as Riley stepped into her space. She smelled of cordite, rain, and copper, and underneath it all, that dark, intoxicating alpha scent that made Riley's mouth go dry. "Let me," Riley said quietly. Valentina stared down at her. She could have broken Riley in half with her good arm. She studied her face, looking for hesitation, for disgust. Slowly, she handed her the forceps. Riley stepped between her knees, leaning in closer. Her hands were surprisingly steady. She wasn't a nurse, but growing up poor meant you learned how to handle minor trauma without racking up a bill. She wiped the blood away with a sterile gauze pad. "Hold still," she murmured. She pushed the curved needle through the tough edge of Valentina's skin. Valentina didn't flinch. She didn't make a sound. She just watched Riley, her gaze heavy, physical, tracking the subtle movements of her hands, the line of her throat, the way she bit her lower lip in concentration. "You're surprisingly good at this," Valentina said. Her voice was low, vibrating in her chest. "My mom couldn't afford the ER when I sliced my hand open on a broken window. I watched a YouTube video." Resourceful. Desperate. Riley tied the knot tight. "There's a difference. She moved to the next stitch. The proximity was intoxicating and terrifying. She could feel the heat radiating off Valentina's skin, could feel the way her scent wrapped around her like a physical touch. "You killed people tonight," Riley said flatly. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Because of me. Because O'Connell crossed a line," Valentina corrected. "You were just the battlefield they chose to fight on." "Don't sanitize it, Valentina," Riley snapped, looking up from her arm to meet her eyes. "They tried to take me because you touched my life. You paid my debt. You dragged me into this. Stop acting like a force of nature. You made a choice." Valentina's eyes darkened. She didn't deny it. She leaned forward slightly, closing the minimal distance between them. "I made a choice to clear a debt," she said, her voice a dangerous whisper. "I do not leave myself indebted to anyone. Not a rival. Not a politician. And certainly not a civilian who bought my crying daughter a hot chocolate." "Well, your ledger is screwed now," Riley fired back, tying off the final stitch and tossing the forceps onto the metal tray with a clatter. She grabbed a bandage and slapped it over the wound, perhaps a little harder than necessary. "Because now I'm a prisoner in your house, waiting to see if a woman I've never met is going to blow my head off. You owe me my life back." Valentina looked at the bandage. Then she looked at Riley. She reached up with her uninjured arm. Riley froze, expecting her to push her away. Instead, Valentina's large, calloused hand wrapped gently around the back of her neck. Her thumb brushed along Riley's jawline. The touch was shocking. It wasn't rough. It was incredibly, terrifyingly gentle. Riley's breath caught in her throat. She stared up into Valentina's eyes, watching the cold, dead ice melt into something far more dangerous. "Heat. I owe you your life back," Valentina repeated softly, her thumb tracing the line of Riley's cheekbone. "Yes. I suppose I do. Which means, until I can give it back to you safely, you are mine to protect." The words sent a shiver down Riley's spine. It wasn't a promise of safety. It was a claim of ownership. She should have pulled away. She should have slapped her hand down. But staring up at the woman who had brought her the world on a bloody silver platter, Riley found, to her absolute horror, that she didn't want to step back at all. "Riley," Valentina breathed. Riley's gaze dropped to her lips. The scent of the alpha was everywhere, in her lungs, in her blood, making her knees weak and her body betray her with a sharp, undeniable pull. Valentina held her gaze for a long, heavy second. Then she dropped her hand. "Go to sleep, Riley." Her voice was rough, turned away as she cleaned up the medical supplies. "The war isn't over yet." Riley backed out of the kitchen, her skin burning where Valentina had touched her. The cage wasn't just velvet anymore. It was pulling shut around her. And the scariest part wasn't the lock. The scariest part was that she was starting to like the woman holding the key. The velvet cage shrank. 2 more days bled into a gray, relentless weekend. The storm outside finally broke, leaving a damp, freezing fog draped over the compound. But the tension inside the house only tightened. Valentina's people moved differently now. The casual quiet professionalism was gone. Hayes wore her tactical vest openly in the kitchen. Cole stood by the front windows, a rifle resting against the sill, her eyes constantly scanning the tree-line. The war was no longer abstract. It was breathing down their necks. Riley felt it in her teeth. The waiting was an acid that ate away at her nerves. She spent the morning building a sprawling, structurally unsound fort out of couch cushions with Sloane in the media room. It kept the girl occupied, kept her mind off the heavy boots pacing the hallways above them. But when Sloane finally fell asleep inside the velvet-lined bunker, exhaustion pulling her under, Riley couldn't sit still. She found Valentina in the subbasement. She hadn't known the house had a subbasement until she followed the dull, rhythmic thudding echoing up through the air vents. She pushed open a heavy steel door, and the smell hit her immediately, burnt powder, lead, and cold concrete. It was a private firing range. Valentina stood at the far end of the lane. She wore a gray t-shirt, ear protection over her ears, her stance wide and rooted. She fired in rapid, deafening pairs, crack-crack, pause, crack-crack. The paper target 50 feet away was missing its center mass, reduced to a ragged empty hole. She stopped, dropping the magazine, clearing the chamber in one fluid, brutal motion. She hit a button, and the paper target zipped down the wire toward her. Only then did she turn and see Riley standing by the door. She pulled the ear protection off, hanging it around her neck. She didn't ask why Riley was there. "O'Connell hit a warehouse on the docks this morning," Valentina said, her voice flat, echoing in the concrete bunker. "Burned it to the foundation. 2 of my people didn't make it out." Riley swallowed hard. The reality of her world, the body count, felt heavy in the sterile air. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's the cost of doing business." Valentina set her handgun on the metal bench, picking up a smaller, compact pistol. A Glock 19. She popped a fresh magazine in, slapped it home, and racked the slide. She turned to Riley and held it out, grip first. "Come here." Riley didn't move. She stared at the black metal. "No." "Come here, Riley." It wasn't a request. She forced her feet to move, walking slowly down the concrete lane until she was standing 2 feet away from Valentina. The Alpha held the gun steady. "I don't want to touch that," Riley said, her voice tight. "I don't care what you want." Valentina stepped closer, the heat radiating off her body cutting through the chill of the basement. "O'Connell is a dead woman walking. She knows it. A cornered animal doesn't plot, it lashes out. If her people manage to breach the gates, Hayes and Cole will die trying to stop them. But if they fail, you need to know how to finish the job. I can't shoot a person. You can. If Sloane is standing behind you, you can." Valentina grabbed Riley's right hand, her grip firm and calloused. She placed the heavy metal frame of the gun into her palm. It was freezing. Riley's fingers automatically curled around the grip. "Wrap your left hand around the right. Thumbs forward." Valentina stepped behind her. She didn't hover, she pressed her chest firmly against Riley's back. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to Riley's spine. She reached around her, her large hands covering Riley's, physically adjusting her grip, forcing her fingers into the correct alignment. Elbows locked. "Lean into it." Her breath brushed Riley's ear. Riley tried to focus on the paper target at the end of the lane, but all she could feel was the solid, immovable wall of Valentina's chest behind her, the scent of cordite and sweat, the terrifying intimacy of the moment. She wasn't giving Riley a rose. She was giving her a tool to kill. In her dark, broken world, this was the ultimate gesture of care. "Squeeze the trigger," Valentina commanded quietly. "Don't pull it. Squeeze." Riley held her breath. She squeezed. The gun exploded in her hands. The recoil snapped her wrists back, the deafening roar bouncing off the concrete walls. She would have stumbled backward if Valentina hadn't been standing there, a physical anchor absorbing the shock. The paper target down the lane violently twitched. A hole appeared near the left shoulder. Her ears rang. Her hands shook. But the paralyzing fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp adrenaline. Valentina stepped back, letting her bear the weight of the weapon alone. Riley fired 10 more rounds. She missed the paper entirely twice. She hit the edge 3 times. By the time the slide locked back empty, her arms ached and her palms were sweating. Valentina took the gun from her, setting it on the bench. Keep it in your nightstand. Keep the safety off. If a woman comes through your door and it isn't me, you empty the magazine into her chest. Riley looked at the empty paper target, then up at Valentina's face. The cold, calculating mob boss was looking at her, but the mask was slipping. Her gray eyes were darkened by something raw, something dangerously close to fear. She was terrified for Riley. Valentina, Riley whispered. Valentina didn't answer. She reached out, her knuckles brushing a stray lock of hair away from Riley's face. It was a fleeting, agonizingly soft touch. Then the mask slammed back into place. Stay upstairs tonight. Lock the door. The lockdown began at dusk. The house transformed from a quiet sanctuary into a staging ground. Riley watched from the top of the stairs as heavy canvas duffel bags were carried through the foyer. Women she had never seen before, hard-eyed, silent, filled the living room, checking weapons, loading magazines, their voices low and sharp. Valentina stood in the center of the chaos, wearing a tactical rig over a black sweater. She was giving orders, pointing to a sprawling map spread across the dining table. She was fully in her element now, a general preparing for a siege. Only, it wasn't a siege. It was an execution. She caught Riley looking down at her. The command center paused for a fraction of a second. She nodded to Hayes, dismissing the women to the garage, and walked to the base of the stairs. We leave in 10 minutes, Valentina said, looking up at her. Where? O'Connell is holed up in a scrapyard on the south side. She pulled her remaining crew in tight. She's waiting for me to bleed out from 1,000 small cuts. Valentina's jaw tightened. I'm going to cut the head off the snake. Riley walked down the stairs, stopping 2 steps above Valentina so they were eye to eye. Is it a trap? Probably. Valentina didn't seem to care. It doesn't matter. She dies tonight, or we do. The stalemate ends. She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out a heavy black phone, handing it to Riley. Press 1. It dials Cole. She is staying behind with 3 people to guard the perimeter. If you hear shooting outside, you take Sloane to the panic room behind the library bookcase. You don't come out until I open the door. Understood? Riley took the phone. It felt like a brick. Valentina? Understood? Valentina repeated, her voice sharp. Yes. Riley swallowed hard. The words felt like sand in her throat. Come back. Valentina stared at her. For a long moment, the silence between them was louder than the women loading rifles in the garage. She reached up, gripping the back of Riley's neck, pulling her forward. She didn't kiss her. She pressed her forehead hard against Riley's, breathing her in, closing her eyes, letting her guard shatter for exactly 3 seconds. Lock the door, Riley. She whispered against her skin. She let her go. Turned. Walked out into the freezing night. The next 6 hours were an exercise in psychological torture. Riley put Sloane to bed at 9. The girl didn't ask where her mother was, she just clutched her battered bear and stared at the ceiling with those ancient, knowing eyes. Riley sat in the armchair by her bed, the Glock 19 resting heavy and cold in her lap. Midnight passed. Then 1 a.m. The silence of the house was absolute. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the reinforced windows made her heart seize. She drank 3 cups of black coffee, but she didn't need the caffeine, pure cortisol was keeping her awake. At 3:14 a.m., the heavy iron gates at the bottom of the driveway groaned open. Riley stood up, her hand gripping the pistol. She stepped out into the hallway, looking down at the foyer. Headlights swept across the frosted glass of the front doors. Brakes squealed. Doors slammed. There was no shouting. No triumphant cheers. Just a grim, heavy silence. The front doors opened. Hayes walked in first. She was limping heavily, her left arm wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage, leaning her weight on another woman. Then Valentina walked in. Riley's breath hitched. She was a nightmare. Her tactical vest was torn, the black fabric glistening with wet blood. Her face was smeared with ash and grease. She moved slowly, mechanically, her eyes hollow and dead. The monster had been unchained. And it had feasted. She stopped in the center of the foyer. She looked up. She saw Riley standing at the top of the stairs. Valentina didn't speak. She just stared at Riley, waiting for the revulsion, waiting for her to see the butcher she truly was and run. Riley didn't run. She set the gun on a hallway table. She walked down the stairs, her bare feet making no sound on the hardwood. She crossed the foyer, ignoring the blood dripping onto the polished concrete, ignoring the exhausted, battered women around them. She stopped in front of Valentina. Up close, the smell of copper and death was overpowering. "Are you hit?" she asked quietly. Valentina looked at her, her gray eyes blinking slowly, as if struggling to process the fact that Riley was standing closer to the blood. "No. Not mine." "Is it over?" "O'Connell is dead. Her lieutenants are dead." Valentina's voice was entirely drained of emotion. "The port is mine again." She looked down at her hands, they were coated in dark, drying crimson. "I am what they say I am, Riley." She whispered, a brutal, ugly confession. "Don't look at me like a savior." "I never thought you were a savior, Valentina." Riley reached out. She didn't hesitate. She placed her clean, warm hands over Valentina's bloody ones. Valentina flinched, trying to pull away to spare her the stain. Riley held tight. "You're the woman who bought her daughter a hot chocolate." Riley's voice was fiercely steady. "And you're the woman who came back to us. That's all I care about." Valentina closed her eyes. A ragged, shuddering breath tore out of her chest. She dropped her head, resting her forehead against Riley's shoulder, her massive frame shaking slightly as the adrenaline crashed. Riley wrapped her arms around her ruined vest, burying her face in her neck, holding the monster together while the dawn finally broke outside. By noon the next day, the compound was scrubbed clean. The bloody tactical gear was incinerated. Hayes was stitched up and back on her feet, fueled by painkillers and black coffee. The war was officially over. The city belonged to Valentina Kane once more. Riley was in the kitchen making Sloane a grilled cheese when Hayes walked in. She didn't wear a gun today, just a crisp suit. She carried a heavy canvas duffel bag and a small plastic bin, setting them on the granite island. "Miss Kane requested I bring these to you," Hayes said, her tone entirely neutral. Riley wiped her hands on a towel, looking into the plastic bin. It was her clothes, the cheap denim jeans, the worn canvas sneakers, the faded flannel shirt she'd been wearing the night the cafe was shot up. They had been washed and neatly folded. Her cracked cell phone rested on top. She looked at the duffel bag. It was unzipped halfway. Inside, Tightly banded stacks of $100 bills were stacked like bricks. It had to be $500,000. Riley felt the floor drop out from under her. A cold, suffocating panic clamped down on her throat. "What is this?" she asked. "Severance." Valentina's voice echoed from the doorway. Riley turned. Valentina stood there, dressed in a sharp navy suit, freshly showered, her hair combed back. The blood and the ash were gone. The vulnerable, shattered woman who had leaned on Riley's shoulder hours ago had been completely erased. She was the CEO again. The ghost story. She walked into the kitchen, her posture rigid. She didn't look at Riley, she looked at the bag. "The threat is neutralized. O'Connell's operation is dismantled. You are no longer in danger." Valentina's voice was smooth, professional. "That bag contains enough untraceable currency to move anywhere in the world. Buy a house in cash. Never work another day in your life. Your old life is waiting. Or a new one. The choice is yours." Hayes quietly slipped out of the kitchen, leaving them alone. Riley stared at the money. Then she stared at Valentina. "You're sending me away?" "I am setting you free," Valentina corrected. "The ledger is clear, Riley. The debt is paid. You survived my world. You don't belong in it. You don't get to decide where I belong." Riley snapped, the anger returning hot and desperate. "You don't get to drag me into this, terrify me, make me care about you, and then just write me a check and push me out the door." Valentina finally met her eyes. The pale gray was turbulent, a storm raging behind the glass. "You patched my wounds. You held a gun for my daughter. You saw me covered in the blood of 6 people, and you didn't flinch." She took a step toward Riley, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am not pushing you out the door, Riley. I am giving you the one chance you will ever have to run before the door locks behind you permanently. I am a killer. I will always be a killer. Today it was O'Connell. Next year it will be someone else. I cannot give you peace. I can only give you violence and money." She gestured to the bag. "Take it. Go." Riley looked at the perfectly tailored suit. She remembered the woman stitching her own arm in the dark. She remembered Sloane sleeping upstairs, finally safe. She looked at the duffel bag. $500,000. Freedom. Safety. Boring, agonizing safety. A life of standing on linoleum floors, looking out the window, waiting for a black SUV that would never come. She reached out and grabbed the zipper of the duffel bag. Valentina's jaw clenched. A flicker of profound, devastating loss flashed across her face, gone before it fully registered. She thought she had won. She thought she had saved Riley from herself. Riley zipped the bag shut. She grabbed the handles, hefted it off the counter, and dropped it onto the floor with a heavy, dismissive thud. She kicked it under the island. Valentina blinked. "What are you doing?" "I don't want your severance package." Riley crossed her arms, her chin tilted up defiantly. "And I don't want my old life back." The coffee was terrible. And the roof leaked. Valentina stared at her, completely derailed. "Riley, you don't understand the reality of what this means." "I understand exactly what it means." Riley fired back, stepping into her space, forcing her to look down at her. "It means I sleep with a Glock in my nightstand. It means I check the perimeter before I take Sloane to the park. It means I have to patch you up when you come home bleeding because you're too stubborn to see a doctor." She reached up, her hands flattening against the lapels of Valentina's expensive suit. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, betraying the calm exterior. "You think you're a monster, Valentina," Riley said softly, her cynical, hardened heart finally cracking open, letting the light in. "Fine. You're a monster. But you're my monster. And I am not going anywhere." Valentina looked down at her. The rigid, terrifying control she held over her entire life finally snapped. She didn't say another word. Her hands tangled in Riley's hair, pulling her up as her mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't a soft, romantic kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and absolute. It tasted like coffee and danger, a violent collision of two women who had survived the dark and decided to stay there together. Riley wrapped her arms around Valentina's neck, pulling her closer, anchoring the ghost story to the earth. The ledger was closed. The debt was paid. But the cost was everything. And as Valentina lifted Riley off the floor, holding her against her chest as if she were the only real thing in her empire, Riley knew she would gladly pay it 1,000 times over.